shining multispectral light on the history of the Sinai Monastery. We know a lot about Sinai in the 4th century. Much of our information comes from the Peregrinatio Aetherea, the account of a pilgrimage to the Holy Land by Egeria. She was from the farthest shore of the Western Sea, the ocean. In the latter 4th century, she made the long and arduous journey to Jerusalem. There she worshipped in the Anastasis, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which had been built only some 50 years before at the command of the Emperor Constantine. The vast nave, which could accommodate multitudes of pilgrims, was adorned with mosaics and costly marbles. The emperor himself had ordered that the ceiling be carved and gilded. The limestone promontory of Golgotha was now surmounted by a cross of gold. The tomb of Christ beyond the nave had been cut free from the surrounding rock face and enclosed in a shrine, the Covocleon. This was now at the center of a great rotunda. Tall columns set around the perimeter supported the dome at an immense height. What was it like to worship in such an edifice? Egeria describes the daily cycle of services. The first was held in the dark of night before cockcrow. Other services followed at dawn, at the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours of the day, and in the evening at the lighting of the lamps. She was also present during the Paschal services, when the church was adorned with curtains of silk embroidered with gold. The clergy brought out communion vessels of gold adorned with precious stones. On Sundays, at the celebration of the liturgy, the bishop would give a sermon. She writes, "Now, forasmuch as in that province some of the people know both Greek and Syriac, while some know Greek alone and others only Syriac, and because the bishop, although he knows Syriac, yet always speaks Greek and never Syriac, there is always a priest standing by who, when the bishop speaks Greek, interprets into Syriac, that all may understand what is being taught. And because all the lessons that are read in the church must be read in Greek, he always stands by and interprets them into Syriac for the people's sake, that they may always be edified. Moreover, the Latins here, who understand neither Syriac nor Greek, in order that they be not disappointed, have all things explained to them, for there are other brothers and sisters knowing both Greek and Latin who translate into Latin for them." In December of the year 383, Egeria traveled along the Via Maris, the road following the Mediterranean coast, to Alexandria. After 10 staging posts, she reached Pelusium, from where she turned south. Another 2 days brought her to Clysma at the head of the Red Sea. Ocean-going vessels would dock there, bringing spices from India. She then traveled for 8 days south along the coast of the Sinai Peninsula before turning west. It took 1 day to reach the oasis of Faran, the biblical Rephidim, where the children of Israel defeated the Amalekites, and another day to come to Mount Sinai, in all a journey of 22 staging posts. When they caught sight of Mount Sinai, their guide told them, "The custom is that prayer should be made by those who arrive here, when from this place the Mount of God is first seen." Even in the 4th century, she was following an established pilgrim route with a developed itinerary about what should be done at each special point. The pilgrims climbed from the west side to the peak of Sinai, where a venerable hieromonk celebrated the liturgy for them. She writes that he was a hale old man, a monk from early life, an ascetes, as they say here. After the liturgy, the monks brought fruits from their gardens for the benefit of the pilgrims, and she writes, "The priests of that place gave us evlogias, that is, of fruits which grow on the mountain." She prayed at the church of the prophet Elijah, a short distance below the summit, where she was diligent to read the appropriate passages of Scripture and then descended the east side of the mountain to the valley below. She writes, "So having made the whole descent of the Mount of God, we arrived at the bush about the 10th hour. This is that bush which I mentioned above, out of which the Lord spake in the fire to Moses, and the same is situated at that spot at the head of the valley where there are many cells and a church." Incorporating Greek words into her account, asketes, evlogias, she shows us what we should have known even without such quotations. From the 4th century, Sinai was an extension of the Holy Land, the far reaches of the Holy Land. As such, it was also a part of the Greek-speaking world. But, like Jerusalem, it also attracted pilgrims from the whole of Christendom. This was true of the monks as well. The 4th century writer Ammonius tells us that of the monks at Raitha, on the coast of the Red Sea, the monk Moses was a native of Pharan. His disciple Psoes was from the Thebaid. The monk Joseph was born in Aila, but the monk Domnus was born a Roman. We also know a lot about Sinai in the 6th century. A marble plaque set into a niche over the entrance preserves this inscription: "This holy monastery of Mount Sinai, where God spake to Moses, was raised from its foundations by the humble Justinian, emperor of the Romans, for an everlasting memorial of him and his consort Theodora. It was completed after the 30th year of his reign." Although the marble plaque itself is not old, perhaps it preserves an older inscription. The 30th year of the reign of the Emperor Justinian would be the year 557. Procopius, the classicizing historian of Justinian, wrote Perictismaton, the buildings, a panegyric on the emperor's many public works projects. He writes, "The Emperor Justinian built them a church which he dedicated to the Mother of God, so that they might be enabled to pass their lives therein, praying and holding services. The bush that burned with fire but was not consumed was seen as a type, a foreshadowing of the Virgin Mary and the Incarnation. This was the original dedication of the monastery." Eutychius, the 10th century Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Alexandria, also known as Said ibn Patrik, wrote a chronicle of the world in Arabic. This is known in Arabic as the Row of Jewels, or from its Latin name, the Annals of Eutychius. He tells us that the Sinai monks sent a delegation to the Emperor Justinian and told him that the tower of refuge that they had was not sufficient for their protection. They asked him to order the construction of a basilica and high surrounding fortress walls. The emperor consented to their request and instructed the governor of Egypt to supply them with men and materials. This was done to protect the monks, to honor this holy place, and to serve as a fortress on what was then the perimeter of the Roman Empire. The church was adorned with mosaics and costly marbles. The emperor also endowed his foundation with icons, manuscripts, vestments, and communion vessels. A massive portal made of cedar leads from the narthex of the basilica into the nave. The horizontal face of the lintel bears the verse from the Psalms, "This is the gate of the Lord, the righteous shall enter by it." The perpendicular face is inscribed, "And the Lord spake unto Moses in this place, saying, I am the God of thy fathers, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I am that I am." The 7th ceiling beam from the west is inscribed, "Hyper mnemis και αναπαύσεως της γεναμένης ημών βασιλίδος Theodoras," for the memory and repose of our late Empress Theodora. The 8th beam has the inscription, "Hyper sotirias tu eusevestatu imon basileus Justinianu," for the salvation of our most pious Emperor Justinian. The inscription on the one beam commemorates the Empress Theodora as having passed away, while the inscription on the other commemorates the Emperor Justinian as still living. We know that the Empress Theodora died in 548, while the Emperor Justinian died in 565. This gives us a range of 17 years for the completion of the church. An anonymous pilgrim from Piacenza in northern Italy visited Sinai in the middle of the 6th century, when the fortress walls of the monastery would only recently have been completed. He writes, "They led us into the valley between Horeb and Sinai. At the foot of the mountain is that spring where Moses saw the sign of the burning bush and at which he gave water to his sheep. The spring is enclosed within a monastery, and the monastery is surrounded by fortified walls. In it are 3 elders who are learned in several languages, Latin and Greek, Syriac, Egyptian, and Besson, as well as many translators of individual languages." We have historical records for Sinai in the 7th century. John Moskos, a monk of Palestine, traveled through the Sinai in the late 6th and early 7th centuries, recording the lives of saintly elders in a work called The Spiritual Meadow. He witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem by the Persians in 614 and lived to see their defeat by the Emperor Heraclius in 627. 2 years later, the emperor traveled to Jerusalem in person to restore the true cross to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. John Moskos' disciple, Sophronius, became the Patriarch of Jerusalem in 634, and it was he, in April 637, who surrendered the city to Caliph Omar, marking the Muslim conquest of the city. The early 9th century chronicle by the monk Theophanes the Confessor contains entries describing the Arab invasion of Palestina Tertia, which included the Sinai Peninsula in 630 to 632. A generation after John Moskos, Anastasius of Sinai followed him, recording the lives of saintly elders. He describes Sinai as a place of austerity. Conditions there could be dangerous, but it was also a place where there dwelt holy anchorites. It was a place where remote chapels would suddenly become luminous in the presence of holy angels. He also wrote a series of questions and answers. These deal with practical matters that one encounters in trying to live the Christian life. Several of his answers show Christians trying to cope with the new political situation of Arab rule. We have 2 further glimpses into circumstances of Sinai at this time. In 1935, the Cold Expedition carried out a series of excavations in Nassana, a town in the Negev desert, the last important stopping point for travelers before they enter the Alti Desert to the south. 2 of the documents are from a provincial governor named Abu Rashid, addressed to a Nassana administrator named George, requesting guides to Mount Sinai. Both are dated to the 12th indiction, suggesting a date of 683 to 684. These provide evidence for continued travel to Mount Sinai 50 years after the Muslim conquest. The numerous inscriptions carved on rock through the Sinai desert are further evidence that this traffic of wayfarers and pilgrims continued under Arab rule. Leontius of Damascus composed a life of Stephen the Sabbaite shortly after 807. He mentions 2 remarkable women who regularly traveled unaccompanied from Damascus to Jerusalem, from where they would continue on to Mount Sinai. We yearn to know what happened at Sinai in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, but here our historians desert us. This is the dark period of Sinai's history. Faran, for example, was the center of ecclesiastical, civilian, and military authority in the Sinai until the Arab conquest. Then it vanishes from record. Today, all of its historical buildings lie in ruins. It is the same with the monastery of Raithal, an imposing complex in the 6th century built of white limestone. Its walls survive to a height of 1 or 2 meters, enough to allow us to reconstruct the layout of the monastery. Who were the last monks of Raithal? When did they leave? We do not know. In the absence of historical records, we must turn to material evidence to piece together the formal history of this period. Sinai was a place where manuscripts were needed for use in the services or to record words of spiritual wisdom to guide the monks in their dedication. If no fresh parchment were available, the solution was to take an older manuscript, one considered less important, perhaps one whose binding was already deteriorating. The manuscript could be disbound and the letters erased, allowing the valuable parchment to be used a second time. From the 19th century, scholars visiting Sinai noted these palimpsests. The undertext was visible in the margins, and often it was of the greatest interest. But where it was written over, it was often illegible. It seemed it had been lost forever. Multispectral imaging is a new technology in which a palimpsest is photographed with separate wavelengths of light. The resulting photographs are then combined and processed to exploit the differences in fluorescence between the 2 or more levels of writing. We began the Sinai Palimpsest project in 2011 when some of the leading experts in the field agreed to work with us on the Sinai manuscripts. The results of the 5-year Sinai Palimpsest project are startling. 6,800 pages photographed from 74 manuscripts, revealing 307 erased texts in 11 languages. In these texts, we have recovered an entire lost library. The first thing we should note is the date of these manuscripts. Some of the texts are from the 5th century, a very few date from as late as the 13th century. All of the rest fall within the period we have been discussing, the 6th century, when the monastery was established as an imperial foundation, the 7th century, when the area came under Arab rule, and the centuries immediately following, for which we must piece together the history from the surviving documentary evidence. The next thing we should note is the geographic range of the manuscripts. The monastery has 7 Ethiopic manuscripts in its collection, the earliest dating from the year 1388. Sinai Greek New Finds, parchment 90, is a palimpsest with a Greek overtext and an undertext in Ge'ez. The overtext dates from the 13th century. The undertext must be earlier and perhaps by some centuries. It is an important witness to travel between Ethiopia and Sinai at that time. 2 Georgian manuscripts, New Finds Parchment 13 and New Finds Parchment 55, have underlying texts in Caucasian Albanian, dated to the 7th or 8th century. This was the language spoken to the east of Georgia in what is today Azerbaijan. These are the only surviving manuscript in this language, which was known earlier only from a few surviving lapidary inscriptions. It had not been known before that copies of the scriptures existed in this language. The undertext of Arabic New Finds Parchment 8 includes passages in Latin of the Gospel of St. Mark written in an insular cursive minuscule, a style of writing developed in Ireland that spread to England, where it flourished between 600 and 850 at such centres as Lindisfarne and Wearmouth Jarrow in Northumbria. This was the age of Aidan and Cuthbert and Bede, the time of an unusual flowering of monasticism in England. Ethiopia, Azerbaijan, the British Isles, These were the farthest reaches of Christendom in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. Traversing vast distances at that time was unimaginably difficult, and scholars have assumed a great deal of isolation. And yet, manuscripts from these remote areas reached Sinai. They show us that monks and pilgrims continued to come to Sinai, attracted by its austerity, its biblical associations, and its reputation as an established center of monasticism. Many of the undertexts in Arabic New Finds 8 are medical treatises. Certain texts by Hippocrates date from the 6th century, making them the oldest surviving examples of those writings. A treatise on medical words and terms also dates from the 6th century. 2 of the medical texts were unknown until now. A careful review of their vocabulary makes it possible that the one containing recipes for different diseases may be the work of Antyllus, a physician who lived in the 2nd century after Christ. The other, containing botanical images similar to Dioscorides, may be the work of Crates, who lived from 111 to 64 before Christ. He was thus a predecessor of Dioscorides. Both of these medical texts date from the 5th century. One bifolium of this manuscript has what appeared to be a faint stain. Under multispectral imaging, a large-scale and carefully drawn herb appeared with the label Philauterion, and an additional note that the leaves of this herb boiled in oil could form a healing paste used to treat scorpion bites. This was a very important discovery. The undertext of Syriac New Finds Fragment 65 contains a Syriac translation of Galen's On Simple Drugs, written in the 9th century. This shows how medical texts from the classical world were transmitted to the Syriac-speaking world. Arabic New Finds 8 also included passages in Latin from the short novella Apollonius of Tyre, with a line drawing of 2 of the characters standing in front of the building. The text dates from the 6th or 7th century. This text was the subject of a workshop held at the University of Toronto. During the workshop, Andras Nemeth, curator of Greek manuscripts at the Vatican, made one particularly significant new discovery. He was able to identify a palimpsested text on 18 recto, written over the Apollonius illustration, as a very early surviving copy of the Athanasian Creed, possibly the earliest that survives. The first translation of the 4 Gospels from Greek into Syriac is known as the Old Syriac. It was made in the latter 2nd century. The Old Syriac was superseded by the Peshitta, made in the 5th century. In general, the Old Syriac was not preserved. Until now, it was only known in the Curetonianus, now in the British Library, and in the Sinaitica Syriacus, Syriac 30, at St. Catherine's Monastery. This latter manuscript is a palimpsest. It was first identified and photographed in its entirety in 1892 by the twin sisters Agnes Smith Lewis and Margaret Dunlop Gibson. The twins returned the following year, together with Robert Bensley, Francis Burkitt, and J. Rendell Harris, for the further study of this important manuscript. They looked at it under sunlight. They even applied a reagent very sparingly to a few passages in their eagerness to recover these faded letters. The text of the Gospels was published in several editions and also translated into English by Agnes Smith Lewis. The Sinai Palimpsest Project has now photographed the entire manuscript with multispectral imaging. Today we can read even more of the text, making it possible to provide a number of improved readings. The project also revealed that Syriac New Finds Parchment 37 and 39 were made up of leaves taken from a single manuscript, and this manuscript also contained the 4 Gospels and the Old Syriac version. Thus, the number of surviving manuscripts containing the Old Syriac version has risen from 2 to 3. Professor Brock writes, "The undertext of 2 of the Syriac manuscripts, which have been imaged by Emil, turn out to have quite a number of folios, 23 and 1/2 folio, from a third old manuscript containing the Old Syriac Gospels. New Fine Syriac 37 consists of 6 folios containing the Syriac translation of Evagrius' Sentences on Prayer. But the 8th century manuscript is palimpsest throughout, and the undertext can be identified as fragments belonging to a third Old Syriac Gospel manuscript in a hand that can be dated to the 6th century. New Fine Syriac 39 is somewhat more extensive, with 18 folios, the last a half. The upper text contains the Syriac translation of the chapters on perfection by Diadochos of Photiki, while the undertext proves to be in the same hand as that of New Fine Syriac 37, and as a number of exact joins makes absolutely certain, belonging to the very same manuscript. The new discoveries contain verses not included in the Curetonianus or the Sinaiticus Syriacus. Some of them offer variant readings that are significant. These are witnesses to the texts of the Gospels as they were in the 2nd century. All of these will be of the greatest interest to scholars of the textual history of the Scriptures. Many of the discoveries among the undertexts recovered by the Sinai Palimpsest Project have been so spectacular that they tend to overshadow our appreciation of every recovered text and fragment. We take it for granted that there will be verses from Genesis and Exodus, from Ecclesiasticus, and from the Gospels of Matthew and John, written in Greek and dated to the 6th century, or the Book of Revelation in Latin, also dated to the 6th century, or Basil of Caesarea's homily on the Martyr Julita, copied in the late 8th or early 9th century. But each of these texts is important, each providing yet another insight into the lost library that has been recovered as a result of this project. John Chrysostom, in his sermons on the Gospel of St. John, said, "As in gold mines, one skillful in what relates to them would not endure to overlook even the smallest vein as producing much wealth, so in the Holy Scriptures it is impossible without loss to pass by one jot or one tittle. We must search into all, for they are all uttered by the Holy Spirit, and nothing useless is written in them." St. John Chrysostom spoke these words to inspire us to search out the meaning and significance of every word and letter of the Holy Scriptures, but they have often come to mind with the recovery of every word and letter of these early manuscripts. Colophons provide us with insights into manuscript production at Sinai. Sinai Georgian New Finds Parchment 19 is a copy of the Iadgari, written in the year 980. The manuscript was not only written on parchment where the original text had been scraped off, but each folio was sewn together from several smaller pieces of parchment, and the scribe was left to cope with the stitches as best he could. In the colophon, after invoking the prayers of many saints, the scribe continues, "I, the great sinner, Giovanni, have been granted the grace to write this holy book, Iadgari, the new Octoikos, which has recently been translated into our language in Cyprus and has come from there on this inferior and badly sewn parchment to serve as an original. I, the great sinner, have done this with my own hand in the days of my wretched old age at Holy Sinai. And I have dedicated it even there to Holy Sinai, to the end that they pray for me and commemorate me, so that pardon may be granted to my soul and the souls of my parents and brothers, and to all my kinsmen in spirit and flesh, alive and deceased." The comparison of manuscripts reveals details about lines of communication between the Sinai monastery and the world at large. Sinai Greek New Finds, Majuscule 2, is a manuscript of the Epistles of St. Paul written in parallel Greek and Arabic, dated to the 9th century. It has recently been suggested that this manuscript was written in Damascus. Gabriel Rodel writes, "The dependency of the Arabic portion of Majuscule 2 upon Sinai Arabic 151 provides us with 867 as the terminus post quem. The identification of the Greek hand with that of Vatican Greek 2282 and the dependency of the Arabic text upon Sinai Arabic 151 allow us to situate Majuscule 2 solidly within Damascus. As more of these texts appear online, scholars will be able to make further comparisons among the Sinai manuscripts and with manuscripts in other libraries to better understand these connections. The monastery's participation in the Sinai palimpsest project is due to the wisdom and foresight of Archbishop Damianos, who is committed to both protecting and sharing the treasures and the spiritual heritage of the Sinai monastery. Michael Phelps of the Early Manuscripts Electronic Library heroically coordinated the many people and institutions involved, and we are all grateful to Professor Claudia Rapp for her work at Sinai, creating the catalog entries for the palimpsest and overseeing the many scholars working on the project. We are grateful to all who participated in this project. The technology for the recovery of palimpsest texts continues to advance, due in large part to those who are present here today. New discoveries continue to be made, and some of the scholars who have worked on these texts most extensively are also with us here today. We wish to express our heartfelt thanks to Jack Tanus, Chair, Committee for the Study of Late Antiquity, and all the staff at the Seeger Center for Hellenic Studies, together with Comparative Antiquity, a Humanities Council Global Initiative, Program in Medieval Studies, Marbas, Manuscript Rare Book and Archive Studies at Princeton, and Special Collections, Princeton University Library, for their sponsorship of this conference and workshop. We are especially grateful to Arcadia Fund, whose support made the Sinai Palimpsest Project possible. There yet remain palimpsests of Sinai that have not been photographed, and we hope to return to this in the future. As I pursue other projects, I am often reminded that there is still more waiting to be discovered in the Sinai Library. In centuries gone by, the priest would read the prayers for the celebration of the Divine Liturgy from a scroll. There are also scrolls for the chanters containing the hymns in, for example, Plagal the First Tone. As these scrolls were written on parchment or paper, were rolled and unrolled, they tended to disintegrate. Today they are rare. But at Sinai, quite a number have survived. There are 31 scrolls in the old collection. Among the new finds, there are over 100 scrolls in Greek, 23 in Syriac, and 10 in Georgian. I recently started photographing these to allow others to study them in more detail. Greek New Find Scroll 6 is written on parchment. It contains the prayers for the Liturgy of St. Basil and has been dated to the 12th century. It is a beautiful scroll written on fine parchment. The words said by the priest aloud are executed in letters of gold. The long prayers that the priest reads to himself begin with a decorative zoomorphic initial executed in gold and bright pigments. Greek New Finds Majuscule 88 is a scroll dated to the 9th or 10th century containing canons. One of them is a Irmos in 4th tone for the 8th ode that is chanted in Orthodox services even to this day. Litrotatu pantos pandodiname, tus en mesophlogos esavisandas, sin katavas edrosisas ke edidaxas melpin, Panta ta erga evlogita imnita ton Kyrion. This scroll was cut down from an Arabic manuscript on the other side. Only one part is overwritten, the rest is clear. But the beginning and the end of every line has been cut off, and the Arabic is written completely without vowel points. In one passage, Father Gregory read the words "sharpwood of Persia." Could it be a manuscript of the Annals of Epictetus? Greek New Finds Majuscule 87 was originally a text written in large and beautifully formed Greek majuscule characters. The parchment was later cut down to make a scroll with the text in Arabic written over the Greek. The Arabic was only written on one side. It is perhaps a legal document. The Greek was executed in large and carefully formed letters, and there are ruling lines for both the top and the bottom of every line of script. This has been dated to the 6th century. The letters are elusive, but seem to be hymns or poetic texts. At Sinai, we began the first service at 4 o'clock in the morning when the stars are still bright in the desert sky. The service concludes around 7 o'clock when the first rays of the sun enter the church, illuminating the mosaic of the Holy Transfiguration in the apse of the basilica. Services continue throughout the day with the reading of the prayers for the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours and the chanting of vespers at the lighting of the lamps. At every service we pray, «Et ideometai iperton makarion ke aidhimon titoran tis hieros manistaftis, Justiniano ke Theodoras ton aimniston Basilion». Again we pray for the blessed and praiseworthy founders of this holy monastery, Justinian and Theodora, the ever-memorable sovereigns. On appointed feast days, we chant the Irmos in 4th tone for the 8th tone that is written on a scroll dated to the 9th century. I could take a lectionary written in Constantinople 1,000 years ago and use it in the services. The language and the readings have remained the same. In the 6th century, Procopius, the historian, wrote, "The Emperor Justinian built them a church, which he dedicated to the Mother of God, so that they might be enabled to pass their lives therein, praying and holding services." Remarkably, after the passage of over 1,400 years, this is still the case. On the day after Pentecost every year, we celebrate the Divine Liturgy at the peak of Sinai. This year, several monks and a few pilgrims left the monastery just before they closed the gates for the night. We slowly made our way up the path in the dark. By the time we reached the ancient steps that lead to the summit, there was a fierce wind blowing. We had to bend down and hold on to the rocks on either side of the steps to keep from getting blown over. We reached the small chapel a little after midnight, which gave us time to clean the chapel and light the lamps and prepare for the celebration of the Divine Liturgy. All of the windows and doors were securely closed. The candles trembled in the wind that still managed to find its way in. A large number of pilgrims from Greece and from Russia joined us at 4 o'clock, and we began the liturgy soon after. As the choir chanted the Oxion Estin, the sun rose, filling the church with golden beams of light. Sinai has been a meeting point for peoples across boundaries of space and language, but it is also a meeting point that spans the centuries. We were standing where Egeria and her fellow pilgrims had stood on that December morning in the year 383, together with the nameless hieromonk, the Ascetes, and after the service we offered the pilgrims something for the feast, Evlogias, as the monks had of old. The centuries fall away. Sinai is indeed a part of the late antique world that has reached us remarkably intact. To be there is to experience this world even today.